free and warm and engaging recording for your podcast. Consider Great Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of energy, equity, and empowerment with your co-hosts, Victoria Cornelio and myself, Jensen Cummings. In today's episode, we are talking legal tools to fight climate change with our guest, Megha Phadkay, an environmental lawyer and climate advocate. She has worked with organizations like UNICEF, Greenpeace International, Clifford Chance, and the Pune International Center, and is a U.S. State Department Climate Action Fellow. Megha is also a TEDx speaker and co-author of the book Sustainable and Climate Resilient Development Challenges for India that came out in 2024. Megha, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here.
I'm excited about this. So we just last week had a youth roundtable where we're really looking for perspective from the next generation of leaders that are going to inherit the status quo and are going to need to make serious strides to improve the landscape that we find ourselves in today. And so seeing and looking into you a little bit, you're a 23-year-old environmental lawyer. You are definitely one of those future leaders. So we're going to talk about your perspective and your experience. I want to see if we can zoom out for just a second and get your take on kind of how your generation is looking at advocacy around climate change, around climate justice. Can you give us a little bit of a kind of a broad perspective, and then we'll get into some of the details?
Yes, sure. I think what you're doing is amazing, even with the podcast and even with the roundtable you mentioned. That is something incredibly exciting because I think bringing together youth activists, not just activists, like students from any and every field together on one table and having them discuss ideas, discuss their concerns about the future, trying to come up with solutions for the same. It's incredibly empowering and it gives us a very different kind of hope that is very sometimes it's very lost in the kind of news we are consuming these days. Everything has a tendency to have a very negative connotation when it comes to the climate crisis, and I think spaces like these where there is a dialogue between the youth which can take some positive connotations as well, connotations of hope, of creativity, of how to regulate yourself emotionally while still working towards climate action. I think something like that is incredibly powering. According to me, in my experience of working with youth, even in my role with UNICEF, as you mentioned, the one thing which I found to be incredibly exciting is that when we are working with students, when we are working with young adults, the most important thing that is that they are still in that bubble. And when I say a bubble, I say it with a very positive outlook towards it. They are away from all the influence of politics, of bureaucracy, and like subconscious biases towards it. So when youth is involved in conversations like this, we feel that their opinions are very raw, they are very unfiltered, they they dare to dream big, and that is exactly what we need for the climate action to go on, to actually have big ideas, to get it all on the table, and then look at the practicality of it and not start with the practicality and you know fight ideas down because before they even bloom out.
I really like that. That's super inspiring because I think what you always hear is for young people, it's like, oh, you're so naive. Like you don't know how things work. That's why you think this can happen. It's like, well, no, let me cook. Let me dream and then we'll bring it back down, right? And I can imagine then as a young person yourself, when you were even younger and you started in this environmental law process, what drew you in? Like why did you say I want to be an environmental lawyer? And how did you realize that this was actually a tool for climate justice?
So when I was 15 years old in the ninth grade back in India, I worked with a community in Nagsara in Maharashtra, which is a state in western India where I come from. So I worked with this community to build sustainable water holes for wildlife. I've since I was maybe in first grade, I've always wanted to work with animals and for their conservation because I love spending time with animals. I think it came from my dad, love for animals. Um, but this project with the community, it made me understand how tribal communities, which have been living with and protecting wildlife, too are under threat. We can't just look at wildlife conservation in isolation. There are various spheres of influence around it, and the closest sphere of influence are the tribal communities living in the forests with such animals. So it was then that I realized how important it is to safeguard both these spaces and the people who protect them together. And to be able to do that, I became a lawyer. Um, so during law school, I interned with an environmental lawyer for 2 years, where I saw realistically how cases are fought and won in courts in the National Green Tribunals, which are the main kind of environmental courts in India, as well as the Supreme Court of India. This made me realize that while activism raises awareness, yes, it's very important, we need it. But along with that, we need legal frameworks because it's ultimately the laws which enforce accountability. So that's why I decided to be an environmental lawyer. And when it comes to climate law or climate policy, it's not as direct as that because we have, at least in India, and most of the global south, we have established laws and legal frameworks for environmental protection. So, for protection of forests, for wildlife, for forest dwelling communities. But what we don't have are climate laws yet. So, there are laws for the environment, but not there's not that kind of very formalized legal structure when it comes to climate. Um, So we have policies, yes, we have various policy documents, we have missions, we have government regulations, but we don't have legal provisions which can be categorized under laws.
Yeah. Can you go a bit more in depth in what the difference between a policy and a law is?
Yes, that is the question I get the most. It can be very confusing at first, yes. Um, so laws, so there are three primary branches of a democracy. First is the legislative, second is the executive, and third is the judiciary. So these are the three pillars of any government. The laws or the list of laws made down by legislative are called laws. So basically, the list of rules made by legislative are called laws, and the list of rules made by the executive are called policies. So policies are not as enforceable as laws are. Policies are sort of left to the discretion of people who are going to follow them. Policies can be interpreted by companies differently. Companies have their own policies, states have their own policies. So there are many layers and many private players also involved in policy making, which we don't see in the case of laws.
Yeah, and then policy can often lead to laws, right? When they gain critical mass and then are passed through the legislative branch. I'm interested broadly in the law and then specifically with climate. Often the case or the lawyer that wins is the one that tells the best story. Right? This is often the case, and I think we see this dramatized in television entertainment all the time. I think it's true. We are storytelling machines as humans. So how do you balance that? And I'm interested in your perspective early on when you were kind of clerking and seeing this in action. How do you balance the legal, the law itself, the precedent with the narrative, especially around climate, because it's so political, it's so socially charged, it's so economically charged. How do you balance that when you're looking at the kind of formulating a lawsuit?
I think climate lawsuits are very exciting in that kind of from that perspective because as I mentioned climate laws are not as developed as much. So in order for a very successful case or a very successful climate lawsuit, it's about the law, yes, obviously, but it is also about good storytelling as you mentioned and the science. So we need all these three parts to build a strong climate lawsuit. So let's start with the law. law is the foundation, so you obviously need a very strong legal argument, whether it's about constitutional rights, whether it's about environmental statutes or international agreements. So without legal basis, even the best story can fall flat in court. And that's when I think people get confused when it comes to petitions, because cases in the court are fought on the basis of legal principles and not popularity. So even if like a million people sign a petition, if you can't prove it on the basis of a legal right which is violated, your case won't win. So it's a very sad truth. Or you can turn it both ways.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then when it comes to strategic litigation, how are communities using this kind of thing that you're talking about to push governments or corporations into climate action, or basically just to protect themselves in that way?
As I mentioned, or as it was mentioned, storytelling is also extremely important, because when you, in some cases, when you don't have strong climate laws, stories come into play to shift that narrative and to plead the case in court if you have some legal basis, obviously. So communities are using climate litigation as a tool in, so we see many different cases when we look at this. So I'll start with a case study for this, because it's very easy to explain it that way. So one of the first and the most famous examples we have of this is the Urgenda case. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. So it's a Dutch name. So it was a case in 2015. So when the Urgenda Foundation in Netherlands, along with 900 Dutch citizens, they sued the Dutch government for failing to adequately reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they cited human rights reasons for that. And they won. That was the most exciting part. So it was a landmark moment because it showed how government could be legally compelled to take climate action. And this was back in 2015, where we didn't have strong national climate policies. All we had was the Paris Agreement. But national policies were not made yet in many different countries. So that isn't a case study from the North, the global North, but from a global South perspective, in the same year, in 2015, we saw a community class action, which is called the Legary judgment. So the name of the case is Legary versus Federation of Pakistan, also like in 2015. So a farmer, along with the entire community, they took the Pakistani government to court for failing to implement its own climate policy, which was a very budding climate policy back at that time. And the Lahore High Court ruled in their favor. So, in judgments like this, we find the power of community driven strategic litigation. Provisions like legal provisions, such as class action suits and public interest litigations, are used to bring together a community to form a case and then present it to the court. So I think that's where community driven strategic litigation plays a huge role.
Yeah, fair. And it sounds like communities are quite involved because I would imagine in the legal or policy driven spaces, these voices tend to be excluded. So, in your experience, I'm guessing this is a great example of how they are included, but do you see that a lot where it centers community voices? Or do you think there's a bit of maneuvering you have to do to get those voices in?
I think both, because we are definitely finding more and more community voices these days on the table, given a voice in conferences, in citizen boards which are formed for deciding landmark judgments. For we see some sort of public participation in environmental cases as well, but it is still not at the point, not at a point which is deemed as sufficient. It's still growing. And I gave the example of these two cases not because community action was very strong back then, but these are the first documented cases where community played a huge role in climate litigation. So it did start back then, but it was very, very rare. And now it is growing, but we don't find it as often. Mostly, as you mentioned, climate litigation has a lot to do with politics, and that's where community voices fall flat. So it's a very fine balance between balancing the local politics and development and environmental concerns. So it's always like a tug of war between these three forces.
And that community aspect, I'm interested for you personally, and I appreciated you sharing how your love of animals and some of that from your father and those early times for you. As you get into the muck a little bit with all of these types of lawsuits and these challenging processes and policy and legalities, it's cumbersome. It feels very heavy. How do you stay grounded? How do you think about that 15-year-old and how you were so inspired to go and support animal welfare, climate justice? How do you stay grounded? How do you stay centered through all of this difficulty that you have put yourself into and are doing this amazing work? But it can be heavy, I'm guessing.
Oh, yes, it can be extremely heavy. And I think when it comes to domains like climate, which are very tangible, and the more you learn about it, the more you go into spaces of climate impacts, the more it impacts you mentally and emotionally. So you really have to set clear boundaries between your emotional space and your motivation to work for it and the professional sphere where you need to collect evidence, you need to build cases, you need to document how climate impacts are felt by the most vulnerable of the communities. So I think what grounds me is being a part of common spaces where there are more climate leaders like you sharing your experiences, giving feedback, because in spaces like these you feel the most understood. And one such space was the one created by Greenpeace. So Greenpeace does this amazing work of an international climate justice camp. So it's a space basically for climate leaders from all the different countries to come together, take a retreat for 7 days, recharge themselves, share stories, have a safe space to voice out their emotions, what they're feeling, and then go back to their work feeling recharged. So I think the more spaces like these we have, the better it'll get to ground ourselves. And on a more individual level, I keep a diary of small wins, which I read every night. So small wins can be anything. It can just be going out in the sun, or it can be writing a book. So it can range from anything. And having that list at the end of the day to go back to helps me stay like grounded and positive and enough.
be able, be able to take a deep breath. I appreciate that because that's going to be important for you for your own personal mental health and your fortitude to be able to continue this fight and this journey that you're on. You mentioned Greenpeace. You've worked with UNICEF as I said on the front end of the show, and other organizations as well. For our organization, Tangelic, who allows us to host this amazing podcast, Tangelic Talks, we're in our infancy in learning how to be a part of the landscape of climate change, climate justice, clean energy, sustainability, right? I'd love for you, selfishly, if you could give us some advice. How are you seeing organizations that are doing the best job of positioning themselves, of creating a foundation, creating also longevity in the work that they're doing? Can you give us some insight there?
I think organizations like big names like these or UN organizations feel very daunting and feel very like mega giants and unreachable. But I think what makes them very again grounded is that they have what are called as local chapters, which that's the way I got involved with UNICEF. And working with these local chapters is the best thing from my perspective, because it helps you study such an abstract and dense concept as climate from a very local, regional, and relevant level when it comes to ground action. So, my suggestion will be go for local chapters. They have small teams, controlled teams focusing on very regional impacts which can be felt in your communities which you are a part of. So, don't go for the name, go for tangible impact which you can make through these local chapters. And then you'll get a wedge into the network, and once you are associated with that local chapter, you'll be able like a whole new domain of networks and connections and amazing people opens up for you. So then you'll be able to work with all the giant players that you want to work with.
I really like that. Yeah, like making it a bit more local and accessible and then going from there. And then since we're talking about those kind of international organizations and frameworks, what role do you see them playing in building a stronger climate legal framework in that sense? So maybe a local chapter is really good at the policies that can then turn into legal frameworks, or is the pressure from international organizations like this pushing for policies to be turned into legal frameworks? Like, do you see them playing a role, or is it quite localized still?
So they definitely play a role, because I think these partnerships of international organizations, of international treaties, even, and local players, these partnerships create a two-way street. So it's not just bottom up, or it's not just top down, it's a two-way street. International alliances and organizations like these, they help us set the vision, zoom out, and look at the same problem from different contexts and different areas of the globe, and bring resources. I think that's the most important. So they do that, and grassroots movements help hold them accountable and help adapt these policies to the local context. So I think both are very essential for the frameworks to work in real world. And we need both of them to sort of take the international policies, adapt them, and as you said, hopefully turn them into strong legal frameworks and laws in the future.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I can imagine a lot of it has to do with, I really like how you said you can have this policy and then adapting it to a local context to make it work. Do you have any examples in your work that you've seen of those kinds of policies sort of making their way into a local setting?
Yes, so I'll give an example of India because I have the most experience working there. So we have one national policy called the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is the only climate policy that we have on the national level. What players like UNICEF and also other local NGOs they're trying to do is adapt this NAPCC, or the National Action Plan, on regional basis. So after those efforts, we were successful in having state action plans on climate change, which is a very state-based, localized, relevant to regional context policy. And now we are further trying to adapt that SAPCC, which is a state action climate plan, on sub-state or regional basis, and hopefully come up with city action plans in the next 1 to 5 years. Let's hope.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good because it sounds a bit like what you were saying with young people. You know, we dream big and then we sort of putting into practicality. So having a very high level thing and then sort of trickling it down into a local level. I think it's something a lot of people tend to be a bit averse to because the top down approach seems so, disruptive. But in this case, it sounds like, having this high level to then sort of get really singular about it tends to work. Yeah, that's really cool. And then this is a complete pivot, but I do need to hear your thoughts on this. What are your thoughts on environmental personhood as a concept of law to help protect, environmental, maybe landmarks that are important to us or that sort of thing? And if you can explain to our audience what environmental personhood is.
Yes, so environmental personhood is a concept where natural element are given legal personhood and legal personalities in the eyes of law. So for example, if you take a river and give it personhood, then you can fight on behalf of the river in courts to demand for its purity, to demand for its protection from water pollution, from getting diverged into other areas, and it essentially losing its personhood. It's a very gray area, yes, because it's extremely difficult to implement it in cases where there are very contradictory rights of like communities and rivers and wildlife and development. So it becomes sort of very muddy and murky waters in that case. But a very important case that I came across like last month, in which this is seen, is was a Uttarakhand High Court judgment in India, where they gave environmental personhood to a river, River Ganga, which is the main river of India. So they were successful in giving it legal personhood. It stemmed from an NGO coming up to court and fighting for its rights. But ultimately, they had to change the decision because, as I mentioned, it's not as easy as giving a personhood and then, oh, everything is hunky dory. There are very, very conflicting interests at play. So you can't, yes, so they reversed the decision very sadly.
It's interesting because we've given corporations personhood, basically. So this makes probably even more sense to me when it comes to that, because it's much more of a living, breathing thing than a corporation is. So you're already doing this. You've already done this by being here and speaking with us today. And I want to take a moment and just continue to inspire the next generation. I have young kids and I want them to look up to role models like the two of you. Absolutely. And so take a second and give some insight and some advice specifically to somebody who's 15 right now, thinking about how their trajectory within this world is going to be shaped and how they're going to help shape the world that they're coming into. Any good tidbits of advice that you have specifically for the youth of this next generation?
I think two things. The first is, and that is what I love about the climate movement, is that be convinced that there is a space for everyone. You don't have to be a climate scientist, you don't have to be a public speaker or a lawyer to be able to do your part to the movement. You can do anything you like under the sky and still contribute to the climate movement. You can be an actor, an author, a dancer, like anyone under the sky and still do your part. And I think that's the beauty of it. It's extremely inclusive. You need to decide how to express yourself and then pave your own way. So, yes, my first advice will be don't have these preconceived notions that you need to be a particular person to have the most impact. You can still be yourself and still contribute. That's the first opinion. And the second one is start conversations. I think conversations starting to talk about climate, about impacts, is the best way to get climate action ready and to actually bring about a change. So start talking about climate. Let it be a dinner time conversation. The more used to you are to all the climate terminologies, and it's not that technical, like easy terms and the impacts, the more empathetic you'll be and the more you'll be able to work in the field later on. So yes, make it an everyday conversation in your family is the second opinion.
And maybe one little extension to that thought. Starting that conversation can be really difficult, especially in that generational conversation. So you're just a kid. What do you know, right? So it gets shut down very, very quickly. How do you push through that? How do you bridge that gap?
Make it pictorial, show them photos, because in my from my experience, kids learn the best when it's many kids, most of the kids are visual learners. So instead of telling them facts and figures and data and like heavy words, it's more useful to just show them photos of what's going on in the world without making it too negative. Of course, we don't want to attach a negative connotation to climate at all. So showing photos, having interesting games like Climate Fresque, which is a very interesting card game for school students. So looking for avenues like this.
Okay, I'm gonna check. I'm looking that up myself. I appreciate that, and I think that the education for ushering in a better future is going to come from the next generation. I think it's time for the elder generations to listen, to spend more time listening. And so just for me personally, being an elder millennial, I appreciate the knowledge and education getting from the two of you. Every week I get so many nuggets of wisdom from Victoria. And so I appreciate the kind of work that you're doing, because it's really important and it's easy to get overlooked and dismissed when there's just such a rigor and structure in place that we've created, and this construct that we've created for ourselves. So thank you for that. And once again, everybody, We never have enough time with our guests. We always have that exclusive content over on the blog posts. So Victoria and Megha are going to stay on for a little bit longer and record some Q&A. So definitely check that out as well. Follow Megha Phadkay on LinkedIn. I know you're active on LinkedIn, so definitely check that out. Megha Law. Search that on LinkedIn and follow your journey there. So once again, everyone, this is Legal Tools to Fight Climate Change, an amazingly inspired episode. We appreciate you all for tuning in. And hopefully, as Megha said, you can be yourself and find your own role, your own voice within climate justice, climate change, and the future of this world. Appreciate you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here again.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic Talks, energy, equity, pride. Empowering the world, side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.